Hey there, it's Martine. If you haven't heard, there is a great deal happening right now if you decide to subscribe to The Washington Post. Right now, 99 cents can get you 4 weeks of the Post. And that's what you can pay for your entire first year, just 99 cents every 4 weeks. If you have thought about becoming a subscriber for a while, this is the time to do it. So hit pause on your podcast app, go to the subscription link in our show notes, or go to washingtonpost.com/subscribe. This offer only goes until June 3rd, so don't wait. And thank you so much. All right, here's the show.
Communiqué. Le gouvernement de la République du Niger porte à la connaissance de l'opinion.
On a Saturday night in March, a spokesman for the military that rules the West African country Niger went on national television. Colonel Major Amadou Abdrahman looked directly into the camera. He appeared stern as he read a statement. The message was clear.
La présence américaine sur le territoire de la République du Niger est illégale.
The American presence on Niger's territory is illegal, he said, and violates all constitutional and democratic rules.
Et viole toutes les règles constitutionnelles et démocratiques.
In other words, the American military presence is done here. Time to get out.
As I'm watching this, I'm thinking wow, this is quite a significant moment because up until this moment, Niger has been the biggest ally for the U.S. in West Africa.
Rachel Chasen is the West Africa bureau chief for the Post. For the last few months, she has been closely following the deteriorating relationship between Niger's junta and the U.S. military, which has an important base in the country.
And I think that there was a lot of hope up until this speech, and even in the weeks after, but up until this speech that the U.S. would be able to maintain its military presence in this country.
According to the U.S. military, this base has been critical for monitoring Islamist extremists that have taken over large swaths of territory in the region. And this week, the Pentagon announced a timeline for the U.S. withdrawal. It'll be completed by the middle of September. But exactly how the relationship between the U.S. and Niger fell apart has not been clear. Nigerian officials had not been talking about what led to the breakdown in negotiations. That is, until a few weeks ago, when Rachel got a phone call.
I got a call from the Prime Minister's office in Niger, basically being like, come to Niger, we're sort of ready to tell our side of the story. And so immediately I said, yes, just tell me when to come. Not too long after that, I found myself in the office of the Prime Minister, actually in the same room where the negotiations with the American delegation had happened, hearing exactly how, in his telling, they had gone down.
Merci beaucoup. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, May 23rd. Today, an interview with the Prime Minister of Niger, telling the behind-the-scenes story of the breakdown between these two countries and what a withdrawal could mean for both Nigerian and American national security interests. So, Rachel, you spoke with the Prime Minister of Niger, and we're going to hear a lot more details about that conversation. But first, can you tell me a little bit more about Niger and this country and its history?
So Niger is a country of 25 million that's north of Nigeria. It's a former French colony where French is still the official working language, but there are also many local languages that are spoken by regular people. It's a massive country with a lot of desert, and the vast majority of the population in Niger is Muslim.
And you said this is a former French colony. Does France have any presence here in Niger anymore?
Niger became independent from France in 1960. It maintained pretty close relations with France for decades after that. And up until last year, there were French soldiers stationed there, It's a pretty big partner when it comes to economic stuff. But the two countries have a complicated relationship. I think that there's also a lot of resentment among regular people toward their former colony, which they feel like hasn't done enough to help them. There's a lot of anger with the French politics and what they feel is like condescension from French politicians and sometimes French people.
Interesting. So up until recently, there has been a French military presence in Niger, but also the U.S. has a base in Niger. Why? Why has the U.S. decided that it's important to have a military presence in this country?
So basically in the early 2000s, after September 11, under the Bush administration, the U.S. started looking at what could be sort of future hotspots for terrorism and trying to figure out how to sort of eliminate it at its roots. And the official U.S. military presence started in a more permanent way in Niger around 2012. What's interesting is that in the last couple of years, and really over the course of the last decade, there have been a number of extremist groups that have taken root in the region called the Sahel, and it includes Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and if you sort of expand it out, some other countries.
Armed groups are inflicting heavy losses to armies and forcing thousands of civilians from their homes.
Hundreds of people have been killed and many more forced to seek safety in camps.
These groups, they're linked to al-Qaeda and they're linked to the Islamic State primarily.
In all, more than 2.5 million have been displaced by the Sahel conflict.
And what they've done is they've besieged certain towns. They have required different communities to pay them taxes. They have committed attacks on populations that don't sort of adhere to their rules. And those rules really depend on the region and the group. But sometimes it is sort of this version of Islamic law that requires women to be veiled and bans music and requires people to read the Quran. And again, it depends on the place, it depends on the group, with some much more extreme than others. And there have also been a large number of attacks by these groups against anything related to the state and against the militaries. And so in Niger specifically, we've seen a large number of attacks by these groups against Nigerian military members.
So, as you said, the U.S. government and the military is worried about the threat of Islamist extremism. I'm sure they're seeing these attacks and maybe trying to prevent them. What exactly is the U.S. military doing in Niger to stop the spread of this kind of extremism or prevent these attacks? What are the actual steps that they have been taking up until now?
So there have been different sort of categories of things that the U.S. has been able to do, and it's changed a bit over the years. But they were able to do a lot of intel gathering from their bases, which meant that they were trying to understand how these groups were operating, where they were operating, and what they were doing. And then they were providing that information to the Nigerian officials, who could then use it to do their own counterterrorism activities. And there's also historically been a lot of training that's happened between U.S. forces and Nigerian forces, in addition to some equipment sales. Part of the intelligence gathering involves this massive drone base that the U.S. built about 6 years ago in northern Niger, in this desert region in Agadez. And so it's a massive facility. I think it cost $110 million to build. And the drones that are flown from there are used to collect intelligence on what these groups are doing in Niger and really around the region.
So it sounds like Niger had been an important political and military ally for the U.S. up until last year, when there was this coup. Can you explain what happened there? Why was the government overthrown?
Yeah, this was a coup that really caught a lot of people in the West by surprise. I think maybe less so in Niger itself. But across the region, there had been a number of coups where democratically elected presidents were ousted by their militaries. But people in the West thought that Niger was sort of the exception, that Niger was this bright spot for democracy in the region. And then on July 26th, this past summer, the military took over.
A group of military officers has announced a coup on national television. They said they've dissolved the constitution in the West African country, suspended all institutions, and closed the country's borders.
It was the head of the presidential guard for the then president, Mohamed Bazoum, that led the coup.
Witnesses report that military vehicles have been blocking the entrance to Mohamed Bazoum's presidential palace.
Bazoum was imprisoned in his presidential palace, and the CNSP named itself the new government, and they've been in power ever since.
And just for the record, the CNSP, that's the name of the group in control of the government now, which translated from French is the National Council for Safeguarding the Homeland. But Rachel, I'm wondering, how did people in Niger react to this takeover? How popular was it?
I think what surprised a lot of people in the U.S. who had sort of seen Bazoum as this really popular figure was that the coup was actually quite popular in Niger. I was able to get to Niger in October, so a few months after the coup, and people were still really celebrating. There would be these massive concerts every night outside of the base where the French soldiers had been stationed. And hundreds of young men, maybe in the initial days, it would even be more than that, were gathered outside of this French military base, sort of singing, dancing, and calling for the French to leave. People were just so excited that the French were leaving. They felt like their country was getting taken back. And they would say, insecurity is a really big problem.
Moi, je m'appelle Boubacar Bourema.
I talked with one guy
Boubacar Bourema,
whose name was Boubacar Bourema, and he was a 49-year-old cleaner who I met when he was sort of sitting by the road after lunch with his friends.
j'ai fait ménage.
And he immediately sort of explained to me that he wanted to talk to me because he had been personally affected by the insecurity in the country.
A touché beaucoup, c'est pour cela que je parle. Moi, j'ai 7 personnes qu'on a tuées. 7 personnes.
That's Boubacar saying, I've been touched very much. I've had 7 people in my family who've been killed. 7 people. He explains to me he believes that this was done by groups linked to extremists. He's not sure which ones.
Voilà, ça là, ils ont tué son père et son mère. C'est nous qui gardons maintenant.
And so then he shows me a photo on his phone of a young child. The child is 7 or 8 months old. And he says, this boy, his parents were killed. They killed his mother and his father.
C'est nous qui occupons de ça.
We're keeping him now. He and his wife are taking care of the child.
Wow. 7 people in one family is an unimaginable number. What do you understand about what actually happened there? And also, how does this relate to his feelings about the French being in his country?
Yeah, so what he told us was that they live in a region of Niger called the Tillabéri region, which is on the border with Mali and Burkina Faso, and which is really a hotspot for the violence and for a number of these extremist groups, including those linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And he told us that the family members were killed at different times in their homes, and that some of the disputes were related to cattle.
Parce qu'ils vont venir pour ramasser les vaches.
And so he explained that obviously for him, insecurity is a huge problem and that he had very, very little confidence in the previous government to handle the situation. And he had a lot more confidence in the new government because they were military leaders, because they wanted to do it on their own, because they were rejecting the French, who he really does not trust. He was hopeful that they could really bring an end to the insecurity.
Oui, maintenant c'est bon. Maintenant c'est très très bon.
So he's saying it's good, it's really good, referring to the security situation. And he's saying that it's because of this that we're happy with the coup d'etat.
Moi, je suis combattre jusqu'à la mort pour moi. Aujourd'hui, si on demande les militaires, je suis prêt pour partir.
He said to me, I would fight to the death for my country if they asked me. If they asked me to leave the military, then I would go. He's talking about the front lines there.
So is his feeling that because these horrible acts of violence happened to his family while the French military was present, that they had basically, like, failed at their job to protect the people there? Or, like, how does he make that connection?
Yeah, I think this is the connection that he and a lot of other people make, this link between these Western forces arrived and then all of this insecurity started. And the reality is that French forces have been in the region for a long time, but they were really pivotal, actually, in neighboring Mali, in crushing an uprising by various extremist groups and separatists. And they were requested by the government there. And the same goes in Niger as well. They were there with the consent of the government, aiding in the fight against these groups.
Yeah, so how did this coup change the relationship between Niger and the U.S. government?
So after the coup happens in July, the U.S. condemns it. They asked Niger to release the president, who was imprisoned at that time, Bazoum, and remains imprisoned. And they encouraged them to get back on a path toward democracy. What they also did was pretty quickly freeze all security assistance that was going from the U.S. toward Niger and really limited their activity to force protection. So just making sure that U.S. forces were kept safe and pretty much doing nothing else. But there was much less hostility toward the U.S. in the months immediately after the coup. And actually regular people in Niger seemed to be pretty fine with the U.S.
So then how did things start to deteriorate to the point that they're asking the U.S. military to leave, or really demanding?
And I think that there was just this massive sort of disconnect between what Nigerian officials wanted and what American officials wanted. And on the one hand, American officials wanted Niger to get back on a democratic path. They wanted us to see a timeline for elections. They wanted to see some sort of progress toward returning to democracy. And what Nigerian officials wanted was help from the U.S. in terms of fighting back against this insecurity. They wanted more materials. They wanted planes, drones, air defense systems, and really the cooperation that their country had experienced before to continue. But they were so frustrated because the security cooperation paused completely after the coup, because that's what's required by U.S. law. But it left this sort of gulf between the two countries.
So you described at the beginning of our conversation that Nigerian leaders decided that they didn't want the U.S. here, and they had this very public speech about the American presence in Niger, how it was illegal, and how they wanted America out. But what actually happened there? Like, why did this country's new leaders ultimately decide that they needed to kick out the American military?
So what happened was that there was this series of meetings between U.S. officials and Nigerian officials beginning in December. So I think that the meeting that really proved a turning point was this March meeting where top officials from the State Department, from the U.S. military's Africa Command, and the Pentagon came to Niamey, and they met with Prime Minister Ali Zain and other Nigerian officials, and they had this meeting that all sides have described as quite tense, in which I went to Niamey recently to talk with the Prime Minister about. We really wanted to know from his perspective how this relationship had deteriorated so much.
After the break, Rachel's exclusive interview with Nigerian Prime Minister Ali Zain. We'll be right back. So this new Prime Minister of Niger, tell me a little bit about him. Like, what is he like?
Yeah, so Prime Minister Zain is a former economist who was trained in France. He was one of Niger's basketball stars back in the day and actually almost went to the United States to play college basketball. He was appointed by the military government a few weeks after the coup as the top civilian in the government right now. And he's really been the person who's at the center of a lot of these negotiations with the United States.
So You got this call from the Prime Minister's office, and they told you that he was willing to talk. What did you do next?
I got to Niamey, and essentially I waited for this interview. I spent Thursday and Friday, and then most of Saturday waiting for this interview. And the actual interview started at around 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. The Prime Minister was really very welcoming. He tells me that he has 2 nieces that are Americans, and then he says, if one day I had to, the other nationality I would choose would be to be an American.
Et je vous dis, je le ferai pas, mais si je devais un jour choisir une nationalité, moi j'aurais choisi une nationalité américaine.
I think that the point he really wanted to get across early on was like, American people are not our enemy. I love the US. A lot of Nigerian officials love the US. We feel incredibly disappointed in how this has all transpired and how the US has sort of reacted to this situation. So there was definitely, like, walking into the interview, there was no sort of hostility or anything. I think on the flip side, he actually really just wanted to be able to share his story.
L'armée nigérienne est côte à côte avec un parapluie.
And he starts off with this, like, metaphor where he's basically like, look, before the coup, we were all under this umbrella, the American army and the Nigerian army. And it was like there was a storm brewing. And then when the coup comes and the rain starts, the American military just pulls out the umbrella and takes it away.
Immédiatement, les Américains ont plié leur parapluie.
And they left us there by ourselves. And what he's getting at with that is, like, the Nigerians really counted on the U.S. before the coup when it came to the security partnership. And because the U.S. froze security assistance after the coup, they felt like they had just been abandoned by one of their best allies. And that really, really upset them. And it upset them that after the coup, the military leaders would try to reach out to the American officials, Zayn said, and they wouldn't get a lot back. And when they were getting stuff back, what they were hearing was, you need to return to democracy, you need to get back on track. But they weren't actually getting a lot of help when it came to these attacks by extremist groups, which were actually spiking in the wake of the coup. So they felt completely abandoned.
But what about that argument that he's describing from the U.S. of, like, yeah, we'll help you if you return to democracy or plan to have elections? I mean, like, what did he say about why they couldn't just do that and then be able to count on help from the U.S. going forward?
I think that that's a completely valid question, and that's really the point that American officials have made repeatedly. Like, all we want to see is a democratic timeline. And I think that that's a point that the Nigerian government has been notably silent on. I don't think that they have a plan to transition back to democracy right now. And Zayn didn't offer any sort of plan in our interview for that transition.
And then what else did he say about, like, the tone and tenor of some of these conversations that he had with the Americans?
So he said that the tone and tenor was quite bad. He said that the top official for African Affairs in the State Department, Molly Fee, who was the head of the delegation, she arrived, she spoke for more than an hour, and he felt that she was really threatening the Nigerian officials about what they could and couldn't do and with whom they could be partners. And he very much felt like the tone was unacceptable and the content of what she was saying was unacceptable. And so he said that when she finished talking, he turned to her and he said,
Je lui ai dit,
Madame,
je vais résumer.
I'm going to summarize for you in 2 points what you've said.
Vous êtes venu nous menacer chez nous.
First, you've come here to threaten us in our own country, and that is unacceptable.
Vous êtes venu nous dire avec qui il faut entretenir des relations.
And you've come to tell us with whom we can have relationships, which is also unacceptable. And you've done it all with a condescending tone and a lack of respect.
Condescendant, avec manque de respect.
I'm just curious, did you reach out to the U.S. government or the State Department about this conversation? Or, like, do they agree that this is how this whole thing played out?
So before this conversation happened, I had talked with Molly Fee after the December meeting. And what she told me was quite clear. Like, we tried to make the choice as stark and as clear as we could. and that it was really important for the US, because of the way our laws work, because of our policies, that Niger get back on some sort of path to democracy. I didn't talk to her again after this meeting with Zain, but I did reach out to the State Department. And in response, a U.S. official said that the message to the Nigerian government was a coordinated U.S. government position delivered in a professional manner in response to valid concerns about developments in Niger. And they also said that the government in Niger was presented with a choice, not an ultimatum, about whether they wished to continue their partnership with us, respectful of our democratic values and national security interests.
Interesting. So I want to go back to one of the complaints that the prime minister brought up with you, which is the sense that the U.S. Is trying to tell him and tell his country, like, what other countries they're allowed to be friends with, right? Like, who they're allowed to have contacts with. Can you describe, like, what is the U.S. concerned about here? What are the other countries that they are worried about Niger having a relationship with, and why are they worried?
In this moment, one country that is definitely a source of concern is Russia, because Russia has been really deepening its relationships in West Africa over the past couple of years. We've seen Russian soldiers fighting with troops in Mali. We've seen Russian troops arrive recently in Burkina Faso. And then in Niger last month, about 100 Russian soldiers arrived in Niamey with an air defense control system that they said would allow Niger to have complete control of its airspace. So Russia has actually a pretty long-standing relationship with Niger and a lot of other West African countries when it comes to the sale of military equipment. And what these countries say is Russia is just a lot easier to deal with than the US when it comes to military sales. They make the sales quickly and there are fewer requirements. But what we've seen is that recently there's also been a deepening of these relationships. And I think that it seems like it's an opportunity for Russia to sort of deepen its bench of allies abroad. And increasingly they're looking at West Africa because these governments need help defending themselves and need help fighting the extremist groups. And that's definitely a cause for concern, including among some service members. I think that there are also some American officials who have approached this with some nuance and understand that it's a multipolar world and you don't have to choose between one or the other.
So now that the Pentagon has officially announced that the U.S. will be withdrawing by September, what does that mean for the U.S.? Like, what does it mean to lose such a strategically important foothold in this part of Africa?
Earlier this year, I talked to General Michael Langley, who's in charge of U.S. military operations in Africa, and I asked him what it would mean to lose the footprint in Niger. And what he said was that it would degrade our ability to do active watching and warning across the region, including for homeland defense. And what he told me that is, if we can't see, then we can't sense. And so we might not see the next threat in the Sahel. He said it would be impactful. And what's become clear as these discussions have continued to evolve is that the U.S. does want to remain in the region. I talked with U.S. officials who told me that they're really in the midst of looking at other potential security partners in the region, including in Ivory Coast and Benin, and that it's not like they're pulling out of the entire region, but there definitely will be a shift in resources.
And as we look ahead to September, what are the biggest concerns for American officials about how the withdrawal of these about 1,000 troops is actually going to play out?
So I actually think that from both the U.S. side and from the Nigerian side, there's a lot of nervousness about this withdrawal. And everyone I talk to wants to make sure that it goes smoothly and that it goes well. The sort of worst nightmare scenario is that it's disorderly, that people get injured, that there are any sort of like big issues.
And I think it's worth being explicit. I can imagine that the scenarios that they're imagining here are either like the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the ways in which that had catastrophic effects on the people left behind, what the fallout from that could be here in the U.S.
That is what people are worried about. And one defense official I was talking to said quite explicitly that, look, like, Afghanistan is in everyone's mind, but everyone is doing everything that they can to not make that be the case. And for so many reasons, it is really different what's happening in Niger. But what people want is basically for the U.S. to come up with a plan and then for them to execute it. And I think that the fear, even on the Nigerian side and a bit on the American side too, is like there is this growing sort of sentiment in Niger that's quite anti-American. So they want to make sure that the U.S. withdrawal happens in a timely manner.
And what do you think is at stake here for regular people in Niger? Like the man you talked to who lost family members because of this extremist violence. Like, what is the outlook for them in a world where the U.S. military is no longer present in their country?
I think a ton is at stake for regular people in Niger. I think, unfortunately, the situation when it comes to attacks by these extremist groups is just getting worse and worse in Niger and in its neighbors. I think that there's still a lot of hope in the country that the military can turn this around. But I think that what remains to be seen is just sort of what impact the departure of these Western forces will have and what these West African troops are going to be able to do. So I think that there are really a lot of questions about what this means for regular Nigerians going forward.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you very much.
Rachel Chasen is the West Africa bureau chief for The Post. Before we go, here is one other story that caught my eye. You might remember back in 2022, when early sales started for Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, and high fees and site outages created an uproar from frustrated fans and from Taylor herself. Now, the U.S. government is taking action. Today, it filed a sweeping antitrust lawsuit against Live Nation Entertainment. That is the parent company of Ticketmaster. It's a landmark case that could dramatically reshape how concert tickets are sold and bought. The Justice Department says the company has abused its unrivaled power in the ticketing and concert industries, and they want Live Nation broken up. Here's U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland.
In recent years, Live Nation Ticketmaster's exorbitant fees and technological failures have been criticized by fans and artists alike. But we are not here today because Live Nation Ticketmaster's conduct is inconvenient or frustrating. We are here because, as we allege, that conduct is anti-competitive and illegal.
In a blog post after the lawsuit was filed on Thursday, Live Nation said it is, quote, absurd to claim that Live Nation and Ticketmaster are wielding monopoly power, end quote. They also argued that Ticketmaster's service charges are no higher than elsewhere and frequently lower. That is it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget about the subscription deal that I mentioned at the top of the show. If you want to take advantage of that, go to WashingtonPost.com/subscribe. You have until June 3rd. Today's show was produced by Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Ted Muldoon and Lucy Perkins. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.